For the first time in decades, we're witnessing what appears to be a fundamental fracture in the axis that has defined Middle Eastern geopolitics since the Soviet era. The supreme leader's sudden departure from Tehran isn't just unusual, it's unprecedented in the Islamic Republic's carefully choreographed power structure. But here's what should really concern us. This coincides with Moscow's calculated diplomatic pivot that nobody saw coming. We've been sold a narrative of unwavering Russia-Iran solidarity for years, yet the evidence emerging from multiple intelligence channels suggests something far more complex and potentially destabilizing. Russia's recent UN Security Council abstention on Iranian sanctions enforcement, coupled with its expanding dialogue with Saudi Arabia and Israel's back-channel communications through Turkey, points to a seismic realignment of interests. The question isn't whether Iran feels betrayed, it's whether this represents a fundamental restructuring of power alliances that will reshape everything from oil markets to nuclear proliferation risks. What we're witnessing may be the early tremors of a geopolitical earthquake that will redefine the global order for the next generation, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. Let me start by addressing what we're actually seeing on the ground, because the reality is far stranger than any headline could capture. Reports began filtering through Persian-language social media platforms roughly 72 hours ago, initially dismissed as rumor and speculation, but now corroborated by multiple independent sources including satellite imagery analysis and diplomatic cable leaks. The Supreme Leader's convoy was observed departing Tehran under extraordinary security protocols, heading toward what appears to be a fortified compound near Qom. Now, for those unfamiliar with Iranian power dynamics, this isn't just a routine relocation. Qom holds immense religious significance, yes, but more importantly, it represents a fallback position, a place where the clerical establishment can consolidate and defend itself when the political center becomes untenable. The timing here is what should set off alarm bells for anyone paying attention to the intricate chess game being played across Eurasia. This movement coincides almost precisely with Sergei Lavrov's unexpectedly warm reception in Riyadh, where the Russian foreign minister spent an unusual amount of time behind closed doors with Saudi intelligence chiefs and military planners. We're not talking about the typical diplomatic photo opportunities and carefully scripted press conferences. We're talking about substantive negotiations that ran hours longer than scheduled, with multiple technical experts from both sides engaged in what can only be described as operational planning sessions. The Saudis don't roll out that kind of red carpet unless something genuinely significant is being negotiated, and Russia doesn't commit Lavrov's time to empty gestures. Now, let's connect some dots that the mainstream analysis conveniently ignores. Over the past 18 months, we've witnessed a dramatic shift in Russia's calculus regarding its Middle Eastern partnerships. The Syria intervention, which many Western analysts predicted would bog Russia down in an endless quagmire, actually provided Moscow with invaluable leverage and strategic positioning. But here's what most people miss. Russia's commitment to Assad's regime never extended to blind loyalty to Iranian objectives in the Levant. Moscow has consistently demonstrated that it views Tehran as a useful partner, not an indispensable ally. The Russians are pragmatists to their core, and pragmatism dictates that alliances shift according to strategic interests, not ideological commitments. Consider what Russia actually gains from its relationship with Iran versus what it potentially gains from normalizing relations with the Gulf states and maintaining functional back-channel communications with Israel. Iranian partnership offers access to certain geographical corridors, some degree of pressure on Western interests in the region, and a counterweight to American influence. But those benefits come with enormous costs: international sanctions complications, constant tension with Israel that threatens Russia's own interests in Syria, and the perpetual risk of being drawn into conflicts that serve Iranian objectives rather than Russian ones. On the other hand, functional relationships with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and even tacit understanding with Israel offer Russia something far more valuable in the current geopolitical climate: economic diversification, energy market coordination, and the ability to position itself as an indispensable mediator rather than a partisan actor. The evidence of this shift has been accumulating for months, but Western media outlets, trapped in their outdated Cold War frameworks, keep missing the signals. When Russia failed to veto UN resolutions critical of Iranian proxy activities in Yemen, analysts chalked it up to diplomatic maneuvering. When Russian military contractors began appearing in areas of Syria traditionally dominated by Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces, effectively displacing them, we were told it was simply operational reorganization. When Moscow conspicuously failed to provide Iran with the advanced S-400 air defense systems that Tehran desperately wanted, despite having no such hesitation in selling them to Turkey and even discussing sales with Saudi Arabia, the explanation offered was technical and bureaucratic delays. But taken together, these aren't isolated incidents. They're data points in a clear pattern of strategic distancing. What's particularly fascinating and deeply concerning if you're sitting in Tehran right now is how this distancing has accelerated precisely as Iran's regional position has become more precarious. The maximum pressure campaign, whatever we think of its architects or motivations, genuinely degraded Iranian economic capacity. The protests that swept through Iranian cities over the past 2 years weren't just about headscarves and social freedoms. They represented a fundamental crisis of legitimacy for the regime. The establishment's ability to project power across its sphere of influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen has been steadily eroding, not because of direct military defeats, but because of economic exhaustion and the grinding attrition of maintaining multiple proxy networks across hostile territory. And here's where Russia's calculation becomes crystal clear. An Iran that's strong enough to be useful but too weak to be independent serves Moscow's interests perfectly. A completely collapsed Iranian regime would create chaos that even Russia couldn't manage, potentially leading to sectarian conflagrations that would make Syria look like a minor skirmish. But an Iran that's been brought to heel, that understands its survival, depends on Russian goodwill, that can be directed and controlled rather than merely partnered with. Now that's an asset Moscow can work with. The question is whether the supreme leader and his inner circle have finally recognized this new reality, and whether the departure from Tehran represents an acknowledgement that the ground beneath them has shifted. Let's talk about what this means for the regional power structure, because the implications cascade outward in ways that will affect everything from oil prices to nuclear proliferation timelines. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been quietly repositioning themselves for this exact scenario for years. Their outreach to Russia, their surprising diplomatic normalization with Syria, despite Assad's Iranian backing, their calculated de-escalation with Iran, even while maintaining defensive postures, all of this makes sense if you understand they were anticipating a Russian pivot. The Gulf states recognized before Tehran did that Moscow's loyalty was transactional, and they positioned themselves to be the more attractive transaction. Israel's role in this realignment is perhaps the most delicate and least discussed element. The Israelis have maintained remarkably sophisticated back-channel communications with Moscow throughout the Ukraine crisis, even as they provided humanitarian support to Kyiv and faced intense pressure from Washington to take harder stances. Why? Because Israeli strategic planners understood that the real existential threat wasn't in Eastern Europe. It was the Iranian nuclear program and the network of Iranian proxies surrounding Israeli territory. If Russia could be convinced to withdraw its protective umbrella from Iran, to allow certain actions to proceed without Russian interference, to perhaps even provide intelligence or tacit coordination, well, that would be worth almost any other diplomatic concession. The fact that Israeli strikes on Iranian positions in Syria have increased in frequency and intensity over recent months, with notably muted Russian responses, suggests these conversations have borne fruit. Now, we need to address the nuclear dimension, because this is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous. Iran's nuclear program has always been about regime survival first and regional dominance second. The calculus was straightforward: achieve either an actual nuclear weapon or the clearly demonstrated capacity to build one rapidly, and you create a deterrent against regime change while simultaneously establishing yourself as the undisputed regional hegemon. But that strategy only works if you have great power backing that prevents preemptive military action during the vulnerable development period. Without Russian diplomatic cover, without the implicit threat that strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities would constitute a broader challenge to Russian interests, the entire strategy collapses. This explains the supreme leader's departure better than any other factor. If Tehran's leadership has concluded that Moscow will no longer provide that protective umbrella, if they believe the Russians might actually facilitate or permit action against Iranian nuclear sites in exchange for other concessions, then the regime faces an existential crisis. The hardline factions that have invested everything in the nuclear program as the guarantor of regime survival would be demanding emergency measures. The pragmatic elements that always question the wisdom of nuclear brinkmanship would be arguing for immediate diplomatic outreach to anyone who might offer an alternative security guarantee. The whole thing could fracture along lines we can barely predict from the outside. Let me paint you a scenario that keeps Middle Eastern intelligence analysts awake at night. Imagine Russia communicates to Iran through channels that leave no fingerprints, that Moscow's continued support is conditional on Iranian compliance with a new set of parameters. These parameters might include withdrawal of forces from certain Syrian positions, cessation of advanced weapons transfers to Hezbollah, acceptance of constraints on the nuclear program, and perhaps even tacit acceptance of a new regional security architecture that includes normalized Saudi-Iranian relations under Russian mediation. The message would be clear: accept these terms and remain a junior partner in Russia's regional strategy, or refuse and find yourself facing a coalition of adversaries without the protection you've relied upon. In this scenario, the supreme leader's departure from Tehran makes perfect sense. You remove yourself from the immediate political battlefield, you position yourself in a location with both religious legitimacy and defensive advantages, and you prepare for whatever comes next. If the regime fractures, you're not trapped in Tehran when the factions start settling scores. If you decide to accept Moscow's terms, you can present it as a strategic retreat rather than capitulation. If you choose to defy Russia and take your chances, you're in a position to rally the most ideologically committed elements of the regime around you, while the pragmatists and reformers become scapegoats for the crisis. The economic dimension here cannot be overstated. Iran's economy has been hemorrhaging for years, but the really critical shortage isn't consumer goods or even industrial capacity. It's hard currency and access to international financial systems. Russia, through various elaborate mechanisms involving everything from oil swaps to cryptocurrency arrangements to old-fashioned gold transfers, has provided Iran with lifelines to the outside world. If Moscow turns off those taps, if Russian intermediaries who've been facilitating Iranian sanctions evasion suddenly become uncooperative, the Iranian regime faces an economic collapse that would make the current crisis look manageable. You can maintain authoritarian control through a lot of hardships, but when you can't pay the Revolutionary Guards, when you can't maintain the subsidy systems that keep the poor from starving, when you can't fund the proxy networks that project your power, that's when regimes fall. What we are potentially witnessing is the culmination of a process that began with Russia's intervention in Syria back in 2015. At that time, Moscow and Tehran appeared to be acting in concert, their interests aligned in preserving Assad and countering Western-backed regime change efforts. But even then, the seeds of divergence were visible to those paying attention. Russia intervened to preserve its Mediterranean naval access and demonstrate its capabilities as a global power broker. Iran intervened to maintain its land corridor to Hezbollah and preserve a client regime. Those objectives overlapped but were never identical, and as the Syrian situation stabilized, the divergence became more apparent. Russia emerged from Syria with enhanced credibility, new military technologies tested in combat, and leverage over multiple regional actors. Iran emerged exhausted, financially drained, and facing enhanced Israeli military pressure. Moscow recognized that continued tight association with Tehran was limiting Russian options and antagonizing potential partners who could offer more than Iran ever could. The Ukraine situation, whatever its origins and whoever bears responsibility, accelerated this calculation by making Russia desperate for economic partnerships that could offset Western sanctions and provide alternative markets. Here's something that hasn't received nearly enough attention. Russia's energy partnership with Saudi Arabia through OPEC Plus arrangements is worth exponentially more to Moscow than anything Iran can offer. The ability to coordinate oil production levels, to manage global energy prices, to use energy policy as a geopolitical weapon. This requires Saudi cooperation, not Iranian cooperation. Iran's oil exports, constrained by sanctions and technical limitations, are a minor factor in global markets. Saudi Arabia's production capacity and willingness to use it strategically makes Riyadh an indispensable partner for any serious Russian energy strategy. If maintaining the Iranian partnership jeopardizes the Saudi relationship, the choice is obvious. The Chinese factor adds another layer of complexity that deserves examination. Beijing has positioned itself as Iran's most important economic partner, but Chinese support comes with its own set of expectations and limitations. China wants Iranian oil at discount prices and infrastructure projects that serve the Belt and Road Initiative, but Beijing has shown zero interest in providing Iran with military backing or diplomatic cover that might jeopardize Chinese interests elsewhere. The China-Iran relationship is purely transactional, and Tehran knows it. Without Russian military and diplomatic support, Iranian leverage even with China diminishes dramatically. We should also consider the internal Iranian dynamics that might be driving this crisis. The regime has never been the monolithic entity that Western media often portrays. There are profound divisions between pragmatists and hardliners, between the elected government and the unelected power structures, between the Revolutionary Guards and the regular military, between the clerical establishment and the technocratic managers trying to keep the economy functioning. A crisis with Russia would exacerbate all these divisions, forcing choices that various factions have been able to avoid as long as external support seemed reliable. The pragmatists, who include elements of the foreign ministry, parts of the business community, and some clerical moderates, have always argued for diplomatic engagement and economic integration as the path to regime survival. They've been consistently overruled by hardliners who insisted that strength, deterrence, and regional power projection were the only reliable guarantees of security. But if Russia's withdrawal of support validates the pragmatist critique, if the hardline strategy is revealed to have led Iran into a strategic dead end, the internal power struggle could become explosive. There's also a generational dimension that matters enormously but gets overlooked in analysis focused on elite power struggles. The Iranian population is young, educated, connected to the outside world through VPNs and satellite dishes, and increasingly alienated from the revolutionary ideology that legitimized the regime. The protests over Mahsa Amini's death weren't isolated incidents. They were manifestations of a deep legitimacy crisis that the regime has been unable to resolve through either repression or concession. If economic conditions deteriorate further because of Russian abandonment, if the regime can no longer deliver even the minimal economic performance that's kept discontent manageable, the risk of genuine revolutionary upheaval becomes very real. Now, let's address what this means for American interests and American policy, because despite our own political dysfunctions and strategic confusions, what happens in Iran still matters enormously for US national security. The Biden administration and now potentially future administrations have been operating under assumptions about Iranian-Russian coordination that may be fundamentally outdated. If Moscow is genuinely pivoting away from Tehran, it creates opportunities for American diplomacy that haven't existed in decades, but it also creates risks of miscalculation and unintended escalation. The opportunity is obvious. If Iran is isolated and weakening, it becomes more amenable to negotiations on nuclear issues and regional behavior. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, whatever its flaws in execution, may have created conditions that are now bearing fruit in ways its architects didn't anticipate. A genuinely isolated Iran, facing economic collapse and regional encirclement without Russian protection, would have powerful incentives to seek accommodation. But here's the risk: cornered regimes do desperate things. An Iranian leadership that believes it faces existential threats might lash out rather than capitulate, might accelerate the nuclear program in a sprint for breakout capacity, might unleash proxy forces in a chaotic attempt to change the strategic equation. The question for American policymakers is whether we have the diplomatic sophistication and strategic patience to navigate this situation toward a stable outcome. That requires understanding the complex dynamics at play, avoiding triumphalist rhetoric that backs Iranian hardliners into corners, maintaining pressure while offering viable off-ramps, and coordinating with partners who have their own interests and agendas. It requires, frankly, a level of strategic coherence that American foreign policy has not demonstrated consistently in recent years. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now in Tehran, Moscow, Riyadh, Jerusalem, and yes, Washington. The Supreme Leader's departure from Tehran may be a temporary security measure, or it may be the beginning of a fundamental transformation of Iranian governance. Russia's apparent pivot away from Iran may be a negotiating tactic to extract better terms from Tehran, or it may be a genuine strategic realignment. The regional actors circling what they perceive as a weakening Iran may be preparing for managed transition, or they may be miscalculating the regime's resilience and capacity for retaliation. What's certain is that the old frameworks for understanding Middle Eastern geopolitics are breaking down before our eyes, and the new architecture that emerges will shape global power dynamics for decades to come.